Marco Castellani adjusted his tie as he stepped into the marble lobby of Torriani Industries, one of Milan's most prestigious investment firms. At 28, he looked younger than his years, with an earnest face that invited underestimation. This morning, like every morning for the past 6 months, he prepared himself for another day of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated as little more than an errand boy by his colleagues. The elevator carried him to the 15th floor, where the real players worked. Marco had studied their moves, learned their patterns, and understood their weaknesses better than they knew themselves. While they saw him as the quiet analyst who fetched coffee and compiled reports, Marco had been building something far more sophisticated behind the scenes. His desk sat in the corner of the open office space, deliberately positioned where he could observe everything while appearing invisible. From this vantage point, Marco had spent months studying the office dynamics with the precision of a Renaissance strategist. He knew that Alessandro Torriani, the CEO's nephew, leaked confidential information to his girlfriend who worked at a competing firm. He understood that senior partner Victoria Mendez had been embezzling small amounts from client accounts for years. Most importantly, he had discovered that department head Carlos Vega was planning to defect to a rival company, taking 3 major clients with him. This information represented power, but Marco had learned from his careful study of Niccolò Machiavelli's writings that timing was everything. Knowledge without strategic application was worthless. The prince who struck too early would fail just as certainly as the one who struck too late. The morning meeting began at 9 sharp, with the senior team gathered around the polished conference table. Marco sat at the far end, notebook open, appearing to take routine notes while actually mapping the subtle power dynamics playing out before him. Carlos Vega dominated the conversation, his voice booming with confidence as he outlined his latest acquisition strategy. "The Bertolini account is practically guaranteed," Carlos announced, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his manner commanding the room's attention. "I've built a personal relationship with their board chairman. They trust me completely." Marco watched as Carlos spoke, noting the slight tension in Victoria's shoulders, the way Alessandro's eyes darted nervously around the room. These people thought they held all the cards, but they had no idea that Marco had been quietly documenting their every misstep for months. After the meeting, Marco returned to his desk and opened a secure folder on his computer. Inside were detailed files on every major player in the office, complete with documentation of their various indiscretions, strategic weaknesses, and hidden agendas. This wasn't simple office gossip or petty blackmail material. Marco had constructed a comprehensive intelligence network that would have impressed the craftiest politicians of Machiavelli's era. His phone buzzed with a text from his contact at the newspaper's business section. Maria Santos had been investigating financial irregularities in Milan's investment sector for months, but she lacked insider access to concrete evidence. Marco had been carefully cultivating this relationship, providing her with small, verifiable tips that established his credibility without exposing his larger strategy. "Meeting tonight at 8, the message read. Café Luna, usual table." Marco smiled slightly as he deleted the message. Tonight, he would begin the first phase of his carefully orchestrated plan. The rest of the day passed in routine fashion. Marco attended meetings, compiled reports, and maintained his facade of eager but unremarkable competence. His colleagues continued to treat him as furniture, discussing sensitive matters in his presence as if he were invisible. This suited Marco perfectly. Every careless comment, every unguarded moment, added another piece to his growing arsenal of strategic intelligence. At lunch, he observed Carlos Vega meeting with representatives from Benedetti Capital, Torriani's primary competitor. The meeting took place at an expensive restaurant 3 blocks away, but Marco had anticipated this and positioned himself at a coffee shop across the street with a clear view of their table. Through his telephoto camera lens, he documented the exchange of documents, the handshake, the unmistakably conspiratorial nature of their conversation. Carlos was moving faster than Marco had expected. The defection would happen within the week, which meant Marco needed to accelerate his timeline. In Machiavelli's world, successful princes adapted quickly to changing circumstances. Rigid plans led to defeat, flexible strategies led to victory. That afternoon, Marco made several carefully calculated moves. First, he anonymously submitted a tip to the Financial Regulatory Commission about suspicious trading patterns in the Mendez portfolio. The tip contained just enough specific information to trigger an investigation without revealing the full extent of his knowledge. Second, he arranged for Alessandro Torriani to discover evidence of his girlfriend's connections to competing firms, planting the documents where Alessandro would find them naturally during his normal workflow. These actions would create chaos and distraction, providing cover for Marco's larger strategy while neutralizing potential threats to his position. Machiavelli had written extensively about the importance of controlling the battlefield before engaging the enemy. Marco was simply applying those lessons to the modern corporate environment. As evening approached, Marco prepared for his meeting with Maria Santos. He selected 3 specific pieces of evidence from his files: documentation of Carlos Vega's secret negotiations with Benedetti Capital, records of systematic client information breaches, and evidence of financial irregularities that could trigger a major scandal. Each piece was carefully chosen to advance his strategic objectives while maintaining his cover as a concerned insider rather than the architect of a sophisticated power play. Café Luna occupied a quiet corner in Milan's financial district, popular with journalists and business professionals who valued discretion. Marco arrived 10 minutes early, selecting a table that offered multiple exit routes and clear sight lines to the entrance. These habits of careful observation and strategic positioning had become second nature to him, influenced by his deep study of how successful leaders throughout history had maintained their advantage through superior preparation and situational awareness. Maria Santos entered at exactly 8 o'clock, her press credentials hanging from a lanyard, her expression focused and professional. She was an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corporate corruption, but she was also ambitious and hungry for the kind of major story that could advance her career to the national level. "You said you had something significant," Maria said, settling into the chair across from Marco. "Something about systematic corruption at Torriani Industries." Marco nodded, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "Everything you need is in there. Financial records, communication logs, documented evidence of client confidentiality breaches. But there's a condition." "What kind of condition?" "You wait 72 hours before breaking the story. No matter what else happens in that time, you wait exactly 72 hours. Maria's eyes narrowed with professional suspicion. "Why the delay? What happens in 72 hours? "Let's just say that timing is crucial in this situation. Break the story too early, and the evidence disappears. Wait too long, and someone else might get there first." Marco leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "This story will make your career, Maria. But only if you follow my timeline exactly." The journalist studied Marco's face, clearly weighing her options. She had worked with him before, and his previous tips had always proven accurate and valuable. Still, the request for a specific delay raised questions about his motives and methods. 72 hours, she repeated. "Starting when?" "Starting now." Marco checked his watch. 8:07 on Tuesday evening. "You break the story at 8:07 on Friday evening, not a minute earlier." Maria picked up the envelope, testing its weight. "What's your angle in all this? Why are you risking your position to expose your own company?" Marco had prepared for this question, crafting an answer that would satisfy her curiosity without revealing his true strategy. "I believe in ethical business practices. What's happening at Torriani Industries goes against everything the financial sector should represent. Sometimes you have to choose between personal advancement and doing what's right." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, the kind of motivation that journalists understood and respected. It was also completely false. Marco's actions had nothing to do with ethics or corporate responsibility. He was executing a carefully planned strategy to eliminate his competition and position himself for rapid advancement within the company hierarchy. After Maria left with the envelope, Marco walked slowly through Milan's evening streets, his mind already focused on the next phase of his plan. Tomorrow would bring the first wave of chaos as Alessandro discovered his girlfriend's betrayal and the regulatory investigation into Victoria's activities began to unfold. Carlos Vega would likely accelerate his defection timeline, possibly making mistakes in his haste to escape the brewing storm. All of these elements would create opportunities for Marco to demonstrate his value to the company leadership. While his colleagues scrambled to manage the various crises, Marco would emerge as a voice of stability and competent analysis. He had already prepared detailed reports on each situation, complete with recommendations for damage control and strategic response. The key to Machiavelli's success had been his understanding that political power flowed to those who could navigate chaos while others floundered. Marco intended to prove that the same principles applied in the modern business world. His apartment overlooked Milan's financial district, a modest space that reflected his carefully maintained image as a struggling junior analyst. The reality was quite different. Marco had been saving money aggressively while living below his means, building a war chest that would support his ambitions once his strategy reached fruition. That night, Marco reviewed his files one final time, checking every detail of his plan. Phase 1 would begin tomorrow with the regulatory investigation and Alessandro's personal crisis. Phase 2 would unfold over the following days as Carlos Vega's defection created opportunities for advancement. Phase 3 would culminate on Friday evening when Maria's story broke, creating the perfect storm of institutional chaos that would elevate Marco from invisible analyst to indispensable strategist. He opened his worn copy of The Prince to a passage he had memorized years ago. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. Tomorrow, his colleagues would begin to discover that quiet Marco Castellani was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The next morning brought news that the Financial Regulatory Commission had opened a formal investigation into trading irregularities at Toriani Industries. Victoria Mendez arrived at the office pale and shaken, immediately requesting a meeting with the CEO. Marco observed her distress with detached professional interest, noting how quickly confidence could transform into panic when someone's hidden vulnerabilities were exposed. Alessandro Toriani appeared equally disturbed, though for different reasons. Marco had arranged for him to discover evidence of his girlfriend's information sharing at exactly the moment when his judgment would be most clouded by the ongoing regulatory crisis. The young man's usual arrogance had been replaced by paranoid uncertainty about who he could trust. Carlos Vega, meanwhile, was making increasingly frequent phone calls and had scheduled several off-site meetings for the remainder of the week. His behavior confirmed Marco's analysis that external pressure would accelerate his defection timeline, potentially creating exploitable mistakes. During the morning staff meeting, CEO Giovanni Toriani addressed the brewing crisis with the kind of corporate speak that revealed more than it concealed. "We're facing some temporary regulatory scrutiny," he announced, his voice steady but his eyes betraying concern. "I expect everyone to maintain the highest standards of professionalism and cooperation during this period." Marco raised his hand politely. "Sir, I've prepared a preliminary analysis of potential reputation management strategies, if that would be helpful." The room fell silent. In 6 months of employment, Marco had never volunteered commentary during senior meetings. His colleagues turned to stare at him with surprise, while Giovanni Toriani's expression shifted from distracted concern to focused attention. "You've prepared an analysis?" the CEO asked. "On your own initiative?" "Yes, sir. I took the liberty of researching similar regulatory situations at other firms and compiled some strategic recommendations." Marco opened his notebook with practiced calm. "I can present my findings now or schedule a separate briefing, whatever would be most appropriate." Giovanni considered this unexpected development. In the midst of mounting crises, here was a junior employee demonstrating exactly the kind of proactive thinking that the situation required. "Present your findings now, Castellani. We need all the insight we can get." Marco stood and moved to the whiteboard at the front of the conference room, projecting confidence and competence that none of his colleagues had seen before. His presentation was flawless, combining detailed research with practical recommendations that addressed both immediate damage control and long-term reputation management. He outlined a 3-pronged strategy: complete transparency with regulators to demonstrate good faith cooperation, immediate implementation of enhanced compliance protocols to show institutional commitment to reform, and proactive communication with key clients to maintain confidence during the investigation period. The firms that weather these situations successfully are those that get ahead of the story rather than reacting defensively, Marco explained, his voice steady and authoritative. We have a window of opportunity to control the narrative, but that window won't remain open indefinitely." When he finished, the conference room remained silent for several seconds. Carlos Vega was the first to speak, his tone carrying a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. "That's actually a very sophisticated analysis, Castellani. Where did you develop this expertise?" Marco smiled modestly. "I've always been interested in crisis management strategy, sir. I study these situations in my spare time." It was another carefully crafted half-truth. Marco did indeed study crisis management, but not as a hobby. He studied it as a weapon, learning how to create crises for his enemies while positioning himself as the solution to problems he had secretly engineered. Giovanni Torriani nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, Castellani. I want you to take point on implementing these recommendations. Report directly to me for the duration of this situation." The promotion was informal but unmistakable. In a single morning, Marco had elevated himself from invisible analyst to crisis management specialist with direct access to the CEO. His colleagues watched this transformation with bewilderment, unable to understand how their unremarkable coworker had suddenly demonstrated such strategic sophistication. As the meeting concluded and people filed out, Marco caught Carlos Vega lingering behind, his expression thoughtful. The department head approached Marco with the calculating look of someone reassessing a potential threat. "Interesting presentation, Castellani," Carlos said, his voice carefully neutral. "Very interesting timing, too." Marco met his gaze directly, allowing a hint of steel to show in his eyes. "Crisis situations tend to reveal hidden capabilities, don't they, sir? In all of us." The exchange lasted only seconds, but both men understood its significance. Carlos was beginning to suspect that Marco might know more about the company's various problems than a junior analyst should. Marco was confirming that suspicion while simultaneously warning Carlos that he was not the harmless observer he appeared to be. The rest of the day unfolded according to Marco's careful orchestration. Victoria Mendez was called into an emergency meeting with the compliance department, while Alessandro Torriani discovered additional evidence of security breaches linked to his personal relationships. Carlos Vega made 3 more phone calls to Benedetti Capital, each one monitored and documented by Marco's network of information sources. That evening, Marco received confirmation that Maria Santos was prepared to break her story exactly as planned. The regulatory investigation was proceeding on schedule, and the various personal crises affecting his colleagues were developing according to his strategic timeline. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. His transformation from invisible analyst to crisis management specialist had been achieved with surgical precision. Now came the more delicate work of Phase 2, positioning himself to benefit from the chaos that was about to engulf Torriani Industries while ensuring that his role in creating that chaos remained completely hidden. Marco understood that the next 48 hours would determine whether his careful planning would elevate him to the senior ranks of corporate power or expose him as the architect of his own company's downfall. Either way, he was committed to seeing his strategy through to its conclusion. As Machiavelli had written, fortune favored the bold, but only when boldness was combined with careful calculation and perfect timing. Marco had spent months preparing for this moment. Now it was time to discover whether his study of Renaissance political strategy could translate into modern corporate success. The morning of Marco's second day as unofficial crisis manager dawned gray and overcast, matching the atmosphere inside Torriani Industries. Word had leaked overnight that the regulatory investigation was expanding, and several major clients had already called requesting emergency meetings to discuss the security of their investments. Marco arrived early, using his new access privileges to review confidential client communications and internal risk assessments. His promotion had come with expanded computer permissions, giving him legitimate access to information he had previously obtained through more creative methods. The irony wasn't lost on him that his reward for secretly undermining the company was official authorization to examine its most sensitive operations. At 7:30, his phone rang. Giovanni Torriani's voice carried the strain of a man who had spent the night fielding calls from angry board members and nervous investors. "Castellani, I need you in my office immediately. We have developments." Marco grabbed his files and headed to the executive floor, where he found the CEO pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. The normally immaculate office showed signs of an all-night crisis session: empty coffee cups, scattered documents, and a whiteboard covered with damage control strategies. 3 more clients called since midnight, Giovanni announced without preamble. The Benedetti Group is claiming they've received better offers from our competitors and threatening to move their portfolio. The Rossi Foundation wants to review their entire relationship with us. And someone leaked details of the investigation to the financial press. Marco absorbed this information with appropriate concern while mentally noting that his strategy was proceeding exactly as planned. The Benedetti Group's threat was Carlos Vega's doing, part of his preparation for defection. The press leak had come through carefully orchestrated channels that would never trace back to Marco himself. "What's our immediate response plan?" Marco asked, opening his notebook with practiced efficiency. "That's what I need from you," Giovanni replied, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "Your presentation yesterday was exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need right now. I'm officially putting you in charge of crisis communications and client retention. Full authority to implement whatever measures you deem necessary." The promotion was even more dramatic than Marco had anticipated. In 36 hours, he had gone from invisible analyst to crisis management director with unprecedented autonomy. His colleagues would be stunned by this meteoric rise, unable to comprehend how someone they had overlooked for months could suddenly demonstrate such indispensable value. "I'll need access to all client communications, full financial records, and authority to make direct contact with our major accounts," Marco said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was requesting. "If we're going to save this situation, I need complete information and the freedom to act quickly." Giovanni nodded immediately. "Whatever you need." The board is meeting this afternoon to discuss potential leadership changes. If we can't stabilize things before then, there are going to be casualties at every level of the organization. The threat was clear: succeed brilliantly or face the consequences of the chaos currently engulfing the company. What Giovanni didn't realize was that Marco had already prepared for exactly this scenario. His strategic planning had included detailed contingencies for every possible outcome, including the collapse of the current leadership structure. Marco spent the next hour reviewing client files and communication records, officially discovering what he already knew from months of covert intelligence gathering. The picture was even worse than Giovanni had indicated. 7 major clients were reconsidering their relationships with Torriani Industries, representing nearly 40% of the firm's total managed assets. Without immediate action, the company would face a cascade of defections that could trigger complete institutional collapse. At 9 o'clock, Victoria Mendez was escorted from the building by security personnel, her employment terminated pending the outcome of the regulatory investigation. Alessandro Torriani had called in sick, allegedly suffering from a stress-related illness that everyone understood was really about his girlfriend's exposure as an information leak. Carlos Vega was conspicuously absent from the morning staff meeting, supposedly visiting clients but actually finalizing his defection arrangements. Marco watched these developments unfold with the detached satisfaction of a chessmaster whose opponents were moving their pieces exactly as predicted. Each crisis created new opportunities for him to demonstrate value and expand his authority within the organization. His first major decision was to schedule emergency meetings with the 3 most critical clients: the Benedetti Group, the Rossi Foundation, and Salvatore Enterprises. Rather than defensive damage control, Marco planned to offer these clients something unprecedented: complete transparency about the investigation, detailed explanations of new security protocols, and exclusive access to enhanced investment opportunities that weren't available to the general market. The strategy was risky but brilliant. Instead of treating the crisis as a liability to be minimized, Marco would reframe it as an opportunity for Torriani Industries to demonstrate superior service and exclusive access. Clients who remained loyal during the difficult period would be rewarded with premium treatment that reinforced their decision to stay. At 10:30, Marco received intelligence that Carlos Vega had been spotted entering the Benedetti Capital offices with a briefcase and several senior Torriani clients. The defection was happening even faster than anticipated, which meant Marco needed to accelerate his response timeline. He immediately called an emergency meeting with Giovanni Torriani and the remaining senior staff. When they gathered in the conference room, Marco presented his analysis with devastating clarity. Carlos Vega is meeting with our competitors as we speak, he announced, placing surveillance photos on the table. He's not visiting clients on company business. He's recruiting them for Benedetti Capital, using the current crisis as justification for why they should abandon us. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Several executives began talking at once, their voices rising with panic and anger. Giovanni Torriani's face went white as he realized the full scope of the betrayal. "How do you know this?" demanded Elena Rossi, the head of client relations. "How did you obtain this information?" Marco had prepared for this question, crafting an answer that would enhance rather than compromise his position. "I've been monitoring unusual client communication patterns since the investigation began. When I noticed Vega's meetings coinciding with client inquiries about competitor services, I decided to investigate further. I hired a private investigator to document his activities." It was a plausible explanation that painted Marco as proactive and resourceful rather than someone who had been conducting surveillance for months. The truth was that Marco had been tracking Carlos's movements long before the current crisis, but his colleagues had no way to verify the timeline of his intelligence gathering. "What do we do about it?" Giovanni asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "We get ahead of the story," Marco replied immediately. "We contact every client Vega has approached and offer them something Benedetti Capital can't match. Exclusive access to our international expansion opportunities, reduced fees for the next 2 years, and personal guarantees from senior management about enhanced security protocols. Can we afford those kinds of concessions?" Elena asked, her financial training evident in her immediate focus on cost implications. "Can we afford not to make them?" Marco countered. "We're facing potential losses of 40% of our managed assets. Even with significant concessions to retain clients, we'll be far better positioned than if we lose them entirely to competitors." The logic was unassailable, and Giovanni Torriani recognized it immediately. "Do it," he ordered. "Whatever it takes to keep our clients, you have my full authorization." Marco nodded with appropriate gravity while internally celebrating another strategic victory. He now had unlimited authority to restructure client relationships, essentially giving him control over the company's entire revenue stream. The power he was accumulating would have taken years to achieve through normal advancement. His crisis was compressing that timeline into days. The afternoon brought a series of high-stakes client meetings that would determine Torriani Industries' survival. Marco approached each one with the confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. His presentations were flawless, combining detailed analysis of the regulatory situation with compelling explanations of how the crisis would ultimately strengthen the firm's operations. The Benedetti Group meeting took place at their offices, a power move designed to emphasize their leverage in the relationship. Marco arrived with a team of legal and compliance experts, projecting an image of transparency and institutional strength. His strategy was to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation while demonstrating that Torriani Industries was responding with exceptional professionalism and enhanced service standards. "We understand your concerns about the investigation," Marco began, his voice steady and confident. "That's why we're prepared to offer you something unprecedented in our industry: complete operational transparency and guaranteed priority access to our most exclusive investment opportunities." The Benedetti Group CEO, a woman known for her harsh negotiating style, listened with skeptical attention as Marco outlined his proposal. Reduced management fees for 2 years, quarterly security audits performed by independent firms, and exclusive access to Torriani's planned expansion into emerging markets. The package was worth millions in lost revenue, but it would be far less expensive than losing the account entirely. "This is certainly comprehensive," the CEO acknowledged. "But how do we know these promises will be honored if your firm doesn't survive the current crisis?" Marco had anticipated this concern and prepared his most persuasive response. "Because this crisis is actually an opportunity for us to demonstrate something our competitors can't match: the ability to maintain exceptional service standards even under extreme pressure. Any firm can perform well in ideal conditions. Only the best firms can exceed expectations during difficult periods. It was a masterful reframe that transformed Torriani's current weakness into a demonstration of strength. The CEO's expression shifted from skepticism to genuine interest as she considered the implications of Marco's argument. The meeting concluded with provisional agreement to continue the relationship under the enhanced terms Marco had proposed. Similar success followed with the Rossi Foundation and Salvatore Enterprises, each client accepting modified arrangements that retained their business while positioning Torriani Industries as a firm that prioritized client relationships above short-term profits. By 5 o'clock, Marco had secured commitments representing nearly 35% of the firm's managed assets, far exceeding what anyone had thought possible under the circumstances. His success rate was so exceptional that Giovanni Torriani called an emergency board meeting to present the results and recommend Marco for immediate promotion to senior management. That evening, Marco received word that Carlos Vega had submitted his formal resignation, effective immediately. The defection was complete, but, instead of devastating Torriani Industries as planned, it had actually strengthened Marco's position by removing a major competitor for senior leadership roles. Marco's phone buzzed with a message from Maria Santos: "Story ready for publication tomorrow evening as planned. Source protection remains absolute." The final phase of his strategy would begin in 24 hours, when Maria's exposé would reveal the full scope of corruption that had been undermining Torriani Industries for years. The story would vindicate Marco's crisis management efforts while permanently eliminating any remaining threats to his advancement. He spent that evening reviewing his files one final time, ensuring that every element of his plan remained on schedule. The transformation had been even more successful than he had dared hope. In 3 days, he had gone from invisible analyst to indispensable crisis manager to likely senior executive. His colleagues had witnessed a meteoric rise that seemed to come from nowhere, when in reality it was the culmination of months of careful strategic planning. The next morning brought news that the board had approved Marco's promotion to Senior Vice President of Client Relations and Crisis Management, a newly created position that recognized his exceptional performance during the company's most difficult period. The appointment came with a corner office, a substantial salary increase, and direct reporting relationship to the CEO. His former colleagues watched this development with a mixture of amazement and resentment. How had quiet Marco Castellani suddenly become the most powerful person in the company after Giovanni Torriani himself? None of them understood that they had been watching the execution of a carefully orchestrated strategy that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. Marco's new office overlooked Milan's financial district from the 22nd floor, a symbolic representation of how far he had climbed in such a short period. As he arranged his files in the mahogany desk, he reflected on the lessons he had learned from his study of Renaissance political strategy. Power flowed to those who understood how to create and exploit crisis situations while maintaining their own immunity from the chaos they had engineered. Successful leaders were those who could navigate complex political environments by understanding the motivations and weaknesses of everyone around them. Most importantly, timing was everything. The difference between brilliant strategy and catastrophic failure often came down to executing the right moves at precisely the right moments. That afternoon, Marco received intelligence that Benedetti Capital was struggling to integrate their new clients, including those recruited by Carlos Vega. The competitive firm lacked the infrastructure to handle rapid expansion, and several of the defected accounts were already expressing dissatisfaction with their new service arrangements. This created an unexpected opportunity for Marco to demonstrate his strategic value even further. He prepared a comprehensive proposal for reclaiming the lost clients, complete with enhanced service packages and competitive fee structures that would make returning to Torriani Industries financially attractive. His presentation to the board that afternoon was met with enthusiastic approval. Marco's ability to turn defensive crisis management into offensive competitive strategy had impressed everyone in the company's leadership structure. He was no longer viewed as someone who had risen to meet an emergency situation, but rather as a strategic asset whose skills could drive long-term institutional success. As Friday evening approached, Marco prepared for the final phase of his plan. Maria Santos's story would break at exactly 8:07, revealing the corruption and mismanagement that had plagued Torriani Industries while highlighting the dramatic reforms that had been implemented under Marco's leadership. The timing was perfect. Marco's crisis management efforts would be vindicated by the story's revelations, while his role in providing information to the journalist would remain completely hidden. He would emerge from the scandal as the executive who had saved the company from institutional collapse, positioning him for even greater advancement in the months ahead. At 7 o'clock, Marco's phone rang with a call from Giovanni Torriani. "Castellani, I just received word that a major exposé about our company will be published tonight. Do we have any advanced knowledge of what it will contain?" Marco paused for exactly the right amount of time, projecting the impression of someone carefully considering sensitive information. "I've heard rumors of an investigation, but nothing specific." "Should I prepare a response strategy?" "Absolutely. I want you to handle all media communications related to this story. Whatever it reveals, you're our point person for damage control and public response." The assignment was exactly what Marco had anticipated. His final promotion would come through his expert handling of the media crisis that was about to break, cementing his position as the indispensable architect of Torriani Industries' recovery. As 8 o'clock approached, Marco positioned himself in his office with a clear view of the newsroom across the street where Maria Santos was preparing to publish the most important story of her career. The investigation would reveal systematic corruption, financial irregularities, and security breaches that had undermined one of Milan's most prestigious investment firms. It would also establish Marco Castellani as the brilliant crisis manager who had transformed institutional scandal into competitive advantage, proving that in the modern business world, as in Renaissance Italy, power belonged to those who understood how to turn chaos into opportunity. The digital clock on Marco's computer displayed 8:07 p.m. when Maria Santos's story went live on the Milan Financial Review's website. The headline read, "Torriani Industries, Inside the Corruption Scandal That Almost Destroyed Milan's Most Trusted Investment Firm." Marco watched the article populate on his screen, noting with satisfaction how perfectly Maria had crafted the narrative to align with his strategic objectives. The story revealed everything: Victoria Mendez's systematic embezzlement, Alessandro Torriani's security breaches, Carlos Vega's industrial espionage, and the regulatory violations that had triggered the investigation. But, more importantly, it painted Marco as the whistleblowing hero who had exposed the corruption and implemented the reforms that saved the company from complete collapse. Sources close to the investigation credit newly promoted Senior Vice President Marco Castellani with identifying the systematic problems and developing the comprehensive response strategy that has allowed Torriani Industries to not only survive the crisis but emerge stronger than before, the article stated. Castellani's innovative approach to crisis management has been praised by industry experts as a model for how financial institutions should handle regulatory challenges. Within minutes of publication, Marco's phone began ringing with calls from business journalists, industry analysts, and competitors seeking his commentary on the scandal. His transformation from invisible analyst to celebrated crisis management expert was now complete and publicly documented. Giovanni Torriani called at 8:15, his voice mixing relief with amazement. "Castellani, have you seen the article? You're being credited as the executive who saved this company. The coverage is actually positive. They're presenting us as a firm that identified problems and fixed them proactively." Marco projected appropriate surprise and humility. "I'm just glad our reform efforts are being recognized, sir. The important thing is that we've demonstrated our commitment to ethical operations and client protection. The board wants to meet with you first thing Monday morning," Giovanni continued. "There's talk of additional promotions, possibly a position on the executive committee. You've exceeded every expectation we had for crisis management." After the call ended, Marco allowed himself a moment of private satisfaction. His strategy had succeeded beyond even his most optimistic projections. The carefully orchestrated scandal had eliminated his competition, elevated his status, and positioned him for continued advancement within the organization. But Marco understood that true strategic success required more than just surviving the immediate crisis. The next phase would involve consolidating his gains and expanding his influence throughout the company's operations. Machiavelli had written extensively about the importance of securing power once obtained, warning that temporary victories could easily transform into permanent defeats without proper follow-through. Over the weekend, Marco worked from his new office, developing comprehensive plans for his expanded role within Torriani Industries. His success in crisis management had given him credibility to propose major organizational reforms that would centralize more authority under his control. He prepared detailed proposals for restructuring the client relations department, implementing new security protocols that he would personally oversee, and establishing direct reporting relationships that would give him insight into every aspect of the company's operations. These reforms were presented as lessons learned from the recent crisis, but their real purpose was to ensure that Marco would never again lack the information and authority necessary to control his professional environment. Monday morning's board meeting exceeded Marco's expectations. The directors were so impressed with his performance during the crisis that they approved not only his promotion to the executive committee but also his proposal to serve as chief risk officer, a newly created position that would give him oversight of legal compliance, client relations, and strategic planning. In 3 months, you've gone from analyst to executive committee member, observed board chairman Roberto Salvatore. That's unprecedented in this company's history. But your performance during our crisis period has demonstrated exceptional strategic capability. Marco accepted the accolades with appropriate modesty while internally calculating the implications of his new authority. As Chief Risk Officer, he would have legitimate access to every sensitive aspect of Torriani Industries' operations. His intelligence-gathering activities would now be part of his official job description, protected by corporate confidentiality rather than conducted in secret. The irony was perfect. His reward for secretly undermining the company was official authorization to monitor everything and everyone within the organization. His first major initiative as Chief Risk Officer was to propose the acquisition of smaller investment firms that had been weakened by market volatility. Marco had identified 3 companies that could be purchased at significant discounts, their distressed status creating opportunities for aggressive expansion. Benedetti Capital is particularly vulnerable right now, Marco explained to the executive committee. Their rapid expansion has created operational problems, and several of their major clients are already expressing dissatisfaction. We could acquire them for roughly 60% of their fair market value. The proposal was audacious but strategically brilliant. Torriani Industries would not only recover from the recent crisis but emerge as the dominant investment firm in Milan by absorbing their weakened competitors. The executives approved Marco's acquisition strategy unanimously, giving him a €50 million budget to pursue strategic purchases. Within 6 months, Marco had orchestrated the acquisition of 4 competing firms, including Benedetti Capital. Carlos Vega, who had defected expecting to join a stronger organization, found himself unemployed when his new company was absorbed by his former employer. The poetic justice of the situation wasn't lost on Marco, who personally delivered Carlos's termination notice during the acquisition integration process. Interesting how circumstances can change so quickly, Marco observed as Carlos cleaned out his desk. 6 months ago, you thought you were moving to a better situation. Now you're looking for work while I'm running the enlarged organization you tried to join. Carlos stared at Marco with the dawning realization that his former colleague had somehow orchestrated not just his own advancement but the destruction of everyone who had underestimated him. You planned all of this, didn't you? He whispered. The investigation, the media attention, even my defection to Benedetti. Marco smiled with cold satisfaction. I learned a long time ago that successful people don't wait for opportunities to appear. They create opportunities by understanding how to influence the forces that shape their environment. The conversation ended there, but Marco knew that Carlos finally understood the scope of what had been done to him. The recognition was part of Marco's strategy. He wanted his former colleagues to realize that their downfall had been engineered by someone they had dismissed as harmless and unremarkable. As Torriani Industries integrated its acquired companies, Marco's influence expanded exponentially. He now controlled the largest investment management firm in northern Italy, with over €2 billion in managed assets and offices in 4 major cities. His staff included more than 300 employees, many of whom had previously worked for the competitors he had eliminated through strategic manipulation. The financial press began referring to Marco as one of Italy's most innovative young business leaders, frequently requesting his commentary on market trends and corporate strategy. He accepted select speaking engagements and interview opportunities, carefully crafting a public image as a brilliant strategist who had saved his company through exceptional crisis management skills. None of the journalists or industry analysts who praised Marco's achievements understood that his success was built on the systematic destruction of his rivals through carefully orchestrated scandals and strategic manipulation. They saw only the results, a meteoric rise from obscurity to prominence that appeared to demonstrate exceptional business acumen. 2 years after Maria Santos's article had exposed the corruption at Torriani Industries, Marco was appointed as the company's youngest ever CEO when Giovanni Torriani announced his retirement. The promotion was universally praised as a logical recognition of Marco's extraordinary contributions to the firm's growth and success. His inauguration speech to the company's employees emphasized themes of ethical leadership, strategic innovation, and commitment to client service. Marco spoke passionately about the importance of trust in the financial services industry and his determination to maintain the highest standards of professional conduct. The audience applauded enthusiastically, unaware that they were listening to someone who had gained power through systematic deception, strategic manipulation, and the careful destruction of anyone who had stood in his way. Marco's transformation was complete. He had become the legitimate face of the organization he had secretly subverted. But success brought new challenges that tested Marco's strategic skills in unexpected ways. As CEO of a major financial institution, he faced scrutiny from regulators, competitors, and media organizations that could expose the methods he had used to achieve his position. Managing this exposure required even more sophisticated application of the principles he had learned from studying Machiavelli's political strategies. Marco established a network of allies throughout Milan's business community, carefully cultivating relationships with journalists, government officials, and industry leaders who could provide protection and support for his continued advancement. He donated substantial amounts to charitable organizations, served on prestigious boards, and maintained a public profile that emphasized civic responsibility and ethical leadership. His private life remained carefully compartmentalized, with few close relationships that could create vulnerabilities or expose his true methods. Marco understood that maintaining power required the same strategic discipline that had been necessary to acquire it. Any moment of carelessness or overconfidence could trigger the kind of systematic investigation that would reveal how he had really risen to prominence. 5 years after beginning as an invisible analyst, Marco Castellani controlled one of Italy's most successful financial institutions and was widely regarded as one of the country's most brilliant business strategists. His methods remained completely hidden, protected by layers of legitimate success that obscured the manipulation and deception that had made his achievements possible. In quiet moments, Marco would return to his study of Machiavelli's writings, finding new applications for Renaissance political strategies in the modern corporate world. The principles remained constant: understand your environment completely, identify and exploit the weaknesses of your competitors, control the flow of information that shapes public perception, and never reveal the true extent of your strategic capabilities until victory is certain. He had proven that intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking could overcome any disadvantage in birth, connections, or initial position. The quiet analyst who had once fetched coffee for his colleagues had become the CEO who controlled their professional destinies, demonstrating that power ultimately belonged to those who understood how to acquire and maintain it through systematic application of proven strategic principles. Marco's success had validated Machiavelli's central insight that political skill could triumph over fortune, birth, and circumstance when applied with sufficient intelligence and determination. The methods might be morally questionable, but the results spoke for themselves. He had transformed himself from invisible employee to industry leader through the careful application of strategies that had enabled ambitious individuals to rise to power for over 500 years. As he prepared for the next phase of his career, potentially expanding into international markets or pursuing political opportunities, Marco reflected on the lessons his journey had taught him. Success required more than just intelligence or hard work. It demanded the willingness to see the world as it really was rather than as it ought to be, the discipline to execute long-term strategies despite short-term setbacks, and the courage to make difficult decisions when competitors hesitated. Most importantly, it required understanding that in competitive environments, victory belonged not to the most deserving or ethical, but to those who most effectively applied the timeless principles of strategic thinking that Machiavelli had identified centuries earlier. Marco had proven that these lessons remained as relevant in modern corporate boardrooms as they had been in Renaissance Italian courts. His transformation from Marco Castellani the invisible analyst to Marco Castellani the celebrated CEO represented more than just personal advancement. It demonstrated that strategic intelligence could still triumph over institutional advantages, that careful planning could overcome systemic disadvantages, and that the principles of effective leadership remained constant across centuries of technological and social change. The quiet young man who had once been overlooked by his colleagues had become living proof that Machiavelli's insights about power, strategy, and human nature retained their validity in any era. Marco's success story would never be told in its complete truth, but it served as a modern validation of the timeless principles that ambitious individuals had used to shape their destinies throughout human history. In his private moments, Marco understood that his greatest achievement wasn't becoming CEO of a successful company, but proving that strategic thinking could still enable exceptional individuals to rise above their circumstances through the intelligent application of proven principles. He had honored Machiavelli's legacy by demonstrating that the lessons of the prince remained as powerful and relevant as ever, even in a world the Renaissance master could never have imagined. The transformation was complete, the strategy had succeeded, and Marco Castellani had earned his place among those who understood that in any competitive environment, victory belonged to those who combined intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking with the courage to act decisively when opportunity presented itself.